Welcome to Fatal Files. Today's video features the harshest, most excruciating deaths that happened in the workplace. From a supervisor who had been cutting corners on equipment inspections for months, dismissing a cracked ladle, to a manager conducting a solo inspection, unaware that a personal grudge was about to follow her inside. It was October 9th, 2017, at the Northridge Waste and Recycling Facility on the outskirts of Fresno, California. The plant processed thousands of tons of trash every week, sorting, shredding, and compacting material before it moved to nearby landfills. Most workers arrived long before sunrise, stepping into a building filled with constant noise, conveyor belts humming, claws slamming, and forklifts moving in and out of loading bays. It was a place built on routine. Everyone had a station, and every task followed a familiar rhythm. One of the workers on shift that morning was 33-year-old Anthony Vega, a garbage collector who had recently been promoted to the indoor sorting line. He was quiet, steady, and known for showing up early. Co-workers said he rarely missed a day and often stayed late to earn extra hours for his 7-year-old son. Anthony wasn't the type to take shortcuts. He listened during safety briefings, kept his space clean, and followed machine distance rules without argument. His job that morning was simple but important. Watch the conveyor that fed trash toward the facility's main compactor. Workers lined both sides of the moving belt, pulling out dangerous or oversized items before they reached the crushing claw. The compactor itself was enormous, thick steel arms designed to press tons of waste into tight blocks. It didn't move quickly, but the force behind each cycle was enough to crush anything in front of it. Because of that danger, employees were warned repeatedly about loose clothing. Jackets had to stay zipped, sleeves needed to be secure. Anything that could get caught in the conveyor was considered a serious risk. Anthony understood this. He had heard the warnings many times, but inside the noisy facility during a busy morning shift, it only took a split second for routine to turn into something else entirely. That week, colder mornings led several workers, including Anthony, to wear heavier work coats. Supervisors reminded staff to zip them fully, but the pace of the shift made some people less strict about it. The plant had also been short-staffed for 2 days, and belts were running a little faster to keep up with the backlog. Nothing felt unusually dangerous, but workers later admitted the environment felt rushed that morning. Around 7:15 a.m., Anthony noticed a jam forming where loose cardboard had folded over itself. Jams were common and usually cleared with a long metal hook or by pausing the belt, but this one was small, and Anthony reached forward to pull the cardboard free. Several workers later said the moment looked routine. As Anthony leaned forward, the loose edge of his work jacket brushed against the conveyor. A rotating roller near the claw caught the fabric and pulled it in. The force yanked him tight against the belt, dragging him toward the compactor before he could react. He tried to brace himself, grabbing at the railing, but the jacket was already wrapped around the mechanism. A sorter standing 2 stations away shouted and slammed the emergency stop button, but the claw was mid-cycle, and machinery like this cannot stop instantly. By the time the system halted, Anthony had been pulled into the crushing zone with the incoming trash. Workers ran toward him, but the damage was already done. Security camera footage and witness statements later confirmed that the entire sequence, from jacket catch to full stop, lasted roughly 5 seconds. Emergency responders reached the compactor area within minutes. After a brief assessment, paramedics confirmed there was no chance of survival. The coroner later ruled the cause of death as massive blunt force trauma from industrial compaction equipment. The plant shut down for the day, while workers were sent home, many still shaken. OSHA arrived that afternoon and began inspecting the machine, guardrails, and emergency stop system. In the following weeks, the facility added snag guards, reduced conveyor speed, updated uniform rules, and completely redesigned Anthony's station to keep workers farther from the intake zone. It was May 25th, 2017, in a mid-sized city in Oregon. A light rain fell over downtown, glass towers reflecting a low, silver sky. Commuters moved through the grid in steady streams at the end of the workday. Scott Mercer was 38, a senior accountant at a regional manufacturing firm with a corner office on the 14th floor. In early spring, he had compiled documentation of millions in fraud across 2 fiscal years. After submitting evidence to federal authorities, an unannounced audit began in early May. His supervisor, Chief Financial Officer Vincent Kemp, 45, had personally authorized the fraudulent transactions and now faced prison time and career destruction. Scott kept a predictable routine. Arriving at 6:45 a.m. each day, he would immediately pour himself a large mug of cold brew coffee from a personal bottle he kept in the small kitchenette refrigerator. In late May, building security footage captured Vincent entering the 14th floor at 5:48 a.m., more than an hour before his usual arrival time. He wore latex gloves and spent 9 minutes in the kitchenette area before leaving. Vincent had used a syringe to inject approximately 150 milliliters of ethylene glycol directly into Scott's 32-ounce cold brew bottle. Ethylene glycol is sweet-tasting, colorless, and blends easily with coffee. The dose was carefully calculated. 100 to 150 milliliters is typically fatal to an adult, causing acute kidney failure and severe metabolic acidosis. Scott arrived at 6:45 a.m. to prepare audit materials before the federal team arrived at 9. He poured his contaminated cold brew into his desk mug and began working. Over the next 50 minutes, he drank nearly the entire mug, consuming approximately 24 ounces of the poison mixture. By 7:40 a.m., he felt nauseous with a pounding headache. Then his vision blurred, and he felt confused and disoriented. He stood to get water but felt dizzy and sat back down, breathing rapidly. By around 8:10 a.m., Scott's condition deteriorated sharply. The ethylene glycol had metabolized into highly toxic compounds that attacked his kidneys and nervous system. His breathing became labored. He reached for his phone, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. Within minutes, he lost consciousness and slumped forward onto his desk. A colleague arriving at 8:35 a.m. found Scott unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin pale and cold. She immediately called 911. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes and rushed Scott to a medical facility where doctors initiated emergency dialysis and administered fompazole, an antidote for ethylene glycol poisoning. But the damage was extensive. Scott never regained consciousness and died at 12:17 p.m. from acute renal failure and cardiovascular collapse. Toxicology analysis detected lethal concentrations of ethylene glycol in Scott's blood, urine, and stomach contents. The cold brew bottle tested positive for contamination with a tiny puncture mark visible in the cap seal. Security footage showed Vincent entering the floor unusually early. His fingerprints were lifted from the refrigerator handle and the cold brew bottle itself, despite his use of gloves. Investigators discovered Vincent had purchased 2 gallons of Prestone antifreeze with cash 4 days prior. Parking lot footage captured his vehicle and license plate. A partially empty antifreeze jug and a 60-milliliter veterinary syringe recovered from a dumpster near Vincent's residence bore his fingerprints and tested positive for ethylene glycol residue. Phone records showed Vincent had called a veterinary supply company 3 days before, inquiring about large-capacity syringes. A handwritten note in Vincent's desk drawer contained calculations matching Scott's coffee bottle volume and lethal ethylene glycol dosage amounts. The death was ruled a homicide. Vincent was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The company faced millions in fines and delisting from the stock exchange, and 3 other executives received prison sentences for their roles in the fraud. It was August 22, 2016, at an agricultural processing facility on the edge of Omaha, Nebraska. The morning shift had just started, and the air felt heavy and humid, thicker than usual for late summer. Trucks lined up at the yard, trains rumbled in and out, and workers moved quickly to keep thousands of tons of corn flowing through the system. In a small control room above the loading area, 24-year-old Sarah Mitchell monitored the grain flow readings, watching each silo's numbers rise and fall on her screens. Sarah grew up on a corn farm in central Nebraska before her family lost the land to debt. Working at Midwest Grain Processing wasn't just a job. It kept her connected to the world she loved. She showed up early, stayed late, and had a natural understanding of how grain behaved inside a moving system. When something clogged or slowed, Sarah noticed it before anyone else. The facility itself was massive. Grain moved through long conveyors, steel augers, and enclosed chutes before settling into rows of storage silos stretching across the yard. On humid days, the corn tended to stick together, forming heavy clumps that clogged machinery and cut the flow rate. This morning was one of those days. The air was damp, and Silo 7 had developed a deep blockage. Sarah watched the flow numbers on her monitor drop sharply. Maintenance staff radioed in a moment later, confirming what she already suspected. The bottom chute wasn't moving grain at all. Under normal conditions, the maintenance team would have scheduled a shutdown before anyone went near a silo. But that morning, different departments were giving conflicting updates. The control room believed the blockage was minor. Maintenance thought the cooling fans were causing moisture buildup, and supervisors were frustrated by the delays. Instead of stopping production, they tried quick fixes, opening and closing feeder gates, reversing a conveyor, and striking the outer panels to loosen the clump. Nothing changed. The grain wasn't moving at all. Eventually, it became clear that someone needed to check the blockage from inside. Sarah volunteered almost immediately. She had grown up around grain and understood how it clumped, shifted, and settled when moisture built up. She told her supervisor she knew what she was doing and that she'd follow the harness procedures the company required. Her supervisor hesitated. He knew that entering a silo, even with a harness, was one of the most dangerous tasks in the facility. Grain could move without warning, and once it started flowing, it behaved like a liquid. But Sarah was confident, and the pressure to get production back on track was real. After a short discussion, he reluctantly agreed. Maintenance workers began setting up the entry equipment. By late morning, Sarah stood at the top hatch of Silo 7, wearing a full-body harness clipped to a lifeline anchored above the opening. The inside of the silo felt still and warm, with a faint smell of dust hanging in the air. Below her, the corn formed an uneven mound, firm in some areas, sloped in others, with a compacted layer somewhere beneath the surface causing the backup. A maintenance worker named Tom stayed at the hatch. His job was to watch her every move, monitor how the grain settled, and alert her if anything looked unsafe. The plan was simple. She would climb down, chip away at the hardened clump, climb out, and restart the flow. It was meant to be a quick job, just enough to get the lines moving again. Sarah descended slowly, testing each step as she settled onto the surface of the grain. She used a long metal rod to chip at the compacted layer. For several minutes, nothing happened. The grain didn't budge. Tom leaned over the opening, watching closely as she worked deeper into the mound. A faint crack sounded from within the pile, small enough that Tom barely heard it, but loud enough for Sarah to feel the shift under her boots. Grain that had been sitting still for hours suddenly loosened, and the surface beneath her feet began to slide downward in a slow, sinking motion. Tom called out, leaning further over the railing. Before she could respond, the entire upper layer of corn broke free, pulling Sarah into a funnel forming beneath her. According to Tom's statement, it happened all at once. The mass inside the silo collapsed inward, forming a funnel. The grain beneath Sarah began pulling downward like a drain opening. She tried to back away, but her feet sank instantly. Tom hit the emergency stop, but by that point, the grain was pulling her deeper. Grain behaves like a liquid when it moves. Once a person sinks past the knees, escape becomes nearly impossible. Within seconds, Sarah was pulled under the surface before Tom could tighten the lifeline. Crews rushed to the silo as Tom called for help. Supervisors alerted emergency services, and firefighters arrived with grain rescue tools. But the collapse inside Silo 7 had buried Sarah deep beneath the surface. Teams worked for hours, cutting access points and removing grain in controlled sections, but by the time they reached her, she had already died from compression and suffocation. Investigators later cited the facility for improper confined space entry and failing to shut down all grain movement systems. New rules were added: mandatory shutdowns before silo entry, supervisor approval for any internal work, and updated training on grain entrapment hazards. It was June 23, 2014, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Rain earlier that week left the drainage roads soft and uneven, while heavy humidity settled over the concrete runoff channels beside the service route. Grass along the ditch had grown nearly knee-high after repeated weather delays, covering debris and broken concrete hidden beneath the overgrowth. Near the drainage corridor, 44-year-old Darnell Obi Purvis was working a maintenance shift for a landscaping contractor assigned to the military base. He had spent years bouncing between warehouse jobs, roofing work, and temporary labor around Fayetteville before finally finding steady groundswork with reliable pay and benefits. Darnell lived alone outside the base and rarely missed shifts. Co-workers described him as quiet and dependable, the kind of worker supervisors trusted with difficult assignments because he usually handled them without complaining. And that probably explains why he ended up working alone after another crew member called out sick. The area had not been serviced for nearly 2 weeks because of rain delays. Tall grass covered sections of eroded concrete lining the ditch, while loose gravel, rusted bolts, and damaged construction hardware had gradually collected near the runoff channels over time. Darnell was operating a commercial walk-behind mower with heavy steel blades spinning at thousands of RPMs beneath the deck. Workers later told investigators the terrain was difficult to inspect properly because thick vegetation hid most of the ground from view. Around 9:55 a.m., Darnell pushed the mower along the edge of the drainage corridor while working alone after another crew member called out sick. Wet grass jammed heavily beneath the deck as the mower cut through overgrowth nearly 10 inches high. And that's actually scary for me, because once the grass gets thick enough to hide the ground completely, operators are basically blind to what is waiting underneath. Seconds later, the mower rolled over a partially exposed steel anchor plate hidden beneath the grass near the concrete edge. Investigators later determined the spinning blade struck the metal hard enough to fracture part of the mower blade itself. Witnesses nearby described hearing a loud metallic snap, followed almost instantly by debris striking the concrete drainage wall beside the route. One jagged steel fragment blasted backward through the mower's discharge opening and shattered Darnell's safety glasses before striking the area around his right eye. And a second fragment tore into the left side of his neck beneath the jawline. The impact knocked him backward onto the wet concrete beside the ditch while the mower continued running near the edge of the drainage channel. Witnesses later said blood sprayed across the mower handles and the concrete wall within seconds. And this is the terrifying part of this story. The moment those blades hit hidden metal, the mower basically fires razor-sharp shrapnel back toward the operator at extreme speed. A nearby grounds worker ran toward Darnell and found him on his back, trying to hold the side of his neck shut with both hands. Blood was pouring through his fingers and draining into the runoff channel beneath him. Witnesses later said the damage around his right eye was already catastrophic from the fragment impact. Emergency services were called immediately, but the isolated drainage access road delayed crews reaching the scene. By the time paramedics arrived, Darnell had already lost a massive amount of blood and was drifting in and out of consciousness. Doctors later found the metal fragment had severed major blood vessels in Darnell's neck. Surgeons attempted emergency repairs, but the blood loss was too severe, and he died less than 3 hours later. Investigators later recovered shattered mower blade sections, rusted construction debris, and the buried steel anchor plate hidden beneath the grass. The mower was also missing a rear debris flap designed to reduce projectile discharge. Darnell's family later received workers' compensation benefits through the contractor's insurance provider, though co-workers reportedly said the payout barely covered funeral expenses and remaining medical bills tied to the emergency treatment. No criminal charges were filed, but the company was required to update mowing procedures around drainage corridors and issue additional protective equipment for operators working in heavy vegetation. Several workers later refused to cut overgrown roots unless the ground was inspected manually beforehand. But after seeing what happened to Darnell, it's hard to blame them. It was September 14th, 2017, inside a poultry processing plant in Springdale, Arkansas. The building stretched across several acres, filled with stainless steel equipment, conveyor belts, and the constant noise of machinery. Temperatures stayed low to keep the product cold, and workers wore layers under their aprons. The plant processed nearly 250,000 chickens a day, and each section of the facility moved at a pace few people outside the industry ever experienced. Among the workers was 26-year-old Maria Gonzalez. She handled the deboning line, one of the fastest stations in the plant. After her father's deportation 3 years earlier, Maria took on the responsibility of supporting her mother and two younger siblings. She often worked double shifts and rarely used her scheduled breaks. Co-workers said she moved with quick, practiced motions, always trying to keep up with the pace of the line. The money wasn't great, but over time helped cover rent, utilities, and school supplies for her siblings. She dreamed of saving enough to move her family into a better apartment closer to town. Holiday demand pushed production even harder that month. For nearly 2 weeks, the main conveyor had been running roughly 15% faster than its designed speed. Workers complained about the pace, but management encouraged extra hours and bonuses to keep the line moving. Maria's station sat next to the mechanical separator, a machine designed to strip remaining meat from bones. It used rotating internal blades and suction pressure to pull pieces through. Safety guards had been removed the previous month in what was described as an efficiency upgrade, allowing quicker access when pieces jammed. Throughout the morning, Maria noticed the separator making an uneven grinding noise. It happened only occasionally, but enough to stand out. She considered calling for maintenance, but she was behind on her quota and didn't want to slow the group. Several co-workers were already struggling to keep up with the increased pace, and stopping the line often meant getting reprimanded. Supervisors paced behind the stations, watching output numbers on handheld tablets. Near lunchtime, the conveyor became even more congested. Carcasses began arriving unevenly, some sliding, others stacking. Maria reached forward repeatedly to keep the flow moving. Across the line, Supervisor Carlos observed the section while checking production counts. He later reported that he noticed Maria working faster than usual, trying to catch up to the incoming product. At around 12:17 p.m., a carcass caught on the edge of the separator's intake chute. Instead of falling into the machine, it sat stuck halfway across the metal lip. Maria moved her left hand toward it, intending to flick it forward so the line wouldn't back up. As she leaned in, the loose fabric of her sleeve brushed near the rotating mechanism. The exposed edge of the intake caught the material instantly. The machine pulled her arm inward before she could step back. Carlos reacted immediately, shouting for the emergency stop while running toward her station. Workers stepped back from the line, stunned by the sudden motion of the intake pulling downward. Maria's knees buckled as the machine yanked her arm past the opening. The emergency stop engaged seconds later, but the damage had already occurred. Internal components forced her arm against metal surfaces inside the chute before the rotation halted completely. Workers from nearby stations rushed over as Carlos and another supervisor worked to free her. A team member at the far end ran to notify medical staff inside the building. The line was shut down, and part of the conveyor system was isolated to allow responder space. Maria remained conscious but severely injured as emergency staff stabilized her arm and prepared her for transport. Paramedics arrived through the loading bay and carried her out using the facility's industrial access ramp. She survived, but doctors amputated her right arm below the elbow due to the extent of the crushing and tearing injuries. In the weeks that followed, federal investigators inspected the plant. They cited the company for removing critical safety guards, increasing conveyor speed beyond safe limits, and failing to respond to reports of equipment malfunction. The facility received more than $2 million in fines and was required to install new safety systems before reopening the deboning line. Maria never returned to the plant. Co-workers later said the accident became a turning point for many employees who began refusing unsafe assignments even if it meant losing overtime. It was October 2016 in Hutchinson, Kansas. The town sat in the middle of wheat country, flat in every direction, the kind of place where the grain elevators were the tallest structures on the horizon and the cooperative at the west end of the highway had been running harvests since before most of its current workers were born. Darrell Poots had worked at the West End grain elevator for 11 years. At 44, he was known for keeping to himself, rarely speaking unless someone addressed him first. He usually ate lunch alone in his truck and had built a reputation as the one operator on the floor who knew the equipment better than anyone else. That reputation had kept him through 2 ownership changes and a full conveyor overhaul. Over time, it also meant he had stopped checking his own work as carefully as he once had. The fall of 2016 brought an unusually large regional wheat harvest, and the cooperative had been running above normal intake capacity since early October. The dust collection units had gone 19 days without a mandated shutdown for cleaning. Daryl had been skipping the manual log entries for nearly 2 weeks. A maintenance technician responsible for conveyor inspections flagged the buildup on the west conveyor housing twice in writing, but Daryl dismissed both reports. A worker at the truck scale station mentioned that the exhaust coming off the west silo smelled different than usual and was told to stay at his post. A filter inspection scheduled for Monday was quietly moved to Wednesday on the shared log by Daryl without notifying anyone. On the morning of October 14th, Daryl overrode the conveyor speed limiter on the West Belt, increasing the airborne dust concentration inside the enclosed transfer corridor. By 6:38 a.m., the scale station worker had noticed a visible brown haze and radioed the maintenance technician, who told him to hold the trucks and began walking over. At 6:41 a.m., Daryl entered the West Silo base access panel to check a jammed auger with a standard work light not rated for grain dust environments. 2 operators were at their conveyor stations inside the corridor. Additional workers had been performing routine maintenance checks inside 2 connected transfer tunnels running off the main corridor. The maintenance technician was 200 feet out. The scale station worker was at the scale booth. 3 truck drivers were idling in the intake queue with a direct sight line to the complex. At 6:44 a.m., Daryl forced open the auger housing plate. The arc from the unrated work light against the metal panel ignited the suspended dust. The fireball moved the length of the corridor in under 1 second. Both operators at the conveyor stations were within the primary path. The pressure wave blew out both access doors simultaneously. 4 seconds later, dust in the second and third silos ignited in a secondary explosion that traveled through both connected transfer tunnels where the additional maintenance workers had been working. The tunnels offered no exit in the time available. The conveyor housing ruptured and shed metal outward. The corridor roof came in. The maintenance technician was knocked off his feet at 200 feet. The scale station worker watched the fireball exit both corridor doors and the secondary explosion take apart the conveyor housing. The truck drivers saw the silo roof lift and a fireball column rise above the complex. Daryl Putz and the workers inside the transfer corridor and connected tunnels did not survive. A 4th operator near the corridor entrance sustained burns and was pulled from the area by the maintenance technician. The west silo and connecting transfer corridor were structurally unsound. The remaining morning shift was evacuated from the complex. An investigation in the months following determined that the dust collection system had not been serviced within its required maintenance window, and that the conveyor speed had been manually increased beyond the standard operating rate on the morning of the incident. The altered log entries were identified during the review. The cause of the explosion was attributed to ignition of accumulated grain dust by a non-rated electrical light source inside the West Silo base access area. Daryl Putz was identified as the operator on record for both the log alterations and the speed override. The case was closed as an industrial accident. No criminal charges were filed. The cooperative was cited by a regulatory body for multiple maintenance and equipment violations. The facility remained closed for several months before partial operations resumed under revised safety protocol. It was March 18, 2016, in Binh Duong Province, Vietnam. Heat from the factory roof trapped the smell of burnt rubber across the processing floor, while conveyor belts shook dust loose from the rafters. Workers later said the shredder line sounded rough that morning, louder than usual, but production never slowed down. Nguyen Thanh Lim was 31 years old and worked at a rubber processing plant outside Ho Chi Minh City. His job was feeding reclaimed rubber slabs into an industrial shredder used to recycle old conveyor belts and tire compounds. He lived with his mother, younger sister, and 2 nephews in a rented apartment and had been saving money for a used Honda motorbike. Just for a quick background, the shredder was basically a huge industrial machine designed to chew through old rubber so it could be recycled and reused. Workers stood on a raised platform, feeding heavy rubber slabs into the system using long steel rods, while the machine ran non-stop for most of the shift. It had already been part of the factory's main production line for years, so to the workers there, it was just another normal piece of equipment they dealt with every day. On that morning, Liam's regular partner called in absent. Factory policy required 2 workers at the station, but the supervisor approved a solo operation to avoid slowing production. Around 9:15 a.m., a forklift delivered a heavy reclaimed slab, later identified as old conveyor belt rubber, which was thicker and harder than normal material. Liam pushed the slab into the hopper using the steel rod. The rubber twisted sideways inside the chute and jammed against the rotating shafts. Witness later said Liam was leaning farther over the opening while trying to force the material downward. The machine continued pulling against the jam with enough force to bend steel supports under heavy load. Workers nearby later said they heard a loud metallic snapping sound before the jam suddenly released. The push rod jerked downward violently. Liam still had both hands on the rod when it disappeared into the hopper. The force pulled him forward before he could let go. And I can't even imagine what happened next. A worker saw Liam's upper body pitch over the hopper opening and ran toward the emergency stop while shouting for help. Liam disappeared headfirst into the machine before anyone could reach the controls. Even after the emergency stop was activated, the shredder shafts continued rotating during deceleration. Investigators later explained that the machine simultaneously compressed and sheared the material. Once Liam's head and shoulders entered the cutting discs, there was no chance of survival. The entire thing lasted only seconds, and that's exactly why this story is our case today. For me, this is one of the most brutal factory deaths I've ever researched because by the time crews opened the machine, there was barely anything left to recover. As the machine struggled against the resistance, the overload alarm activated across the processing floor. Emergency crews arrived minutes later and found the shredder jammed with processed rubber granules. Recovery crews spent nearly 2 hours dismantling the housing before removing the remains. Several workers reportedly refused to go near the machine afterward. The post-mortem examination found catastrophic crushing and shearing injuries caused by high-torque industrial machinery. Investigators later used dental fragments and part of a tattoo on the left calf to confirm identification. Labor inspectors later fined the factory for operating dangerous equipment without proper guarding and for allowing solo operation at the shredder station. A steel mesh guard was installed over the hopper opening less than a week later, and production resumed shortly afterward. It was November 3, 2013, at a crowded international airport terminal in London, England. Imagine the usual airport chaos, clanging suitcases, loud boarding calls, and that sterile smell of freshly mopped floors. Right in the middle of the afternoon rush, 38-year-old Emeka Okafor was being escorted to a deportation flight. Emeka had spent 7 years in the UK after arriving on a student visa from Nigeria. Over time, his visa expired, and he survived by taking cash jobs around South London, unloading trucks, helping market vendors, and making deliveries. That afternoon, 2 private security officers were assigned to escort him to a flight bound for Lagos. Unlike regular passengers boarding through the terminal, deportees are often driven directly across the airfield to planes parked on remote stands, completely away from the main gates. On paper, the process is tightly controlled and usually uneventful. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Emeka was taken from a holding area and put into a secure airport van. Witnesses said he seemed completely calm during the drive across the airfield, but as the van pulled up to the waiting aircraft, his entire demeanor changed. He became visibly distressed, his eyes locked onto the massive plane parked right ahead of him. You can only imagine the absolute panic crashing down on him in that moment, realizing that 7 years of hard work and his entire life in the UK were about to end in a matter of minutes. The aircraft was an Airbus preparing for departure from a remote stand. Most of the ground servicing had already been completed, and the pushback tug had disconnected and moved away from the aircraft. As part of the normal departure sequence, one of the jet engines had just been started while ground personnel cleared the area. When the van stopped about 100 feet from the plane, the officers opened the door to transfer Emeka for boarding, and that was the exact moment everything took a different turn. As one officer stepped out, Emeka suddenly lunged through the opening and broke free. He sprinted across the open asphalt before either officer could even react. Security immediately gave chase, and nearby ramp workers started yelling warnings. Multiple CCTV cameras caught what happened next, and according to investigators, it looked like Emeka didn't even have a destination. He kept looking over his shoulder at the officers chasing him, completely focused on escaping rather than where he was actually running. Ahead of him sat the Airbus, with one engine running as the crew prepared for departure. Between the plane and a nearby service road, there looked like an open path. Investigators believe Emeka was trying to reach that road to keep running. The problem was, that path cut directly through the engine intake hazard area. This is the part of the story where your stomach just drops. If you work on a tarmac, you know the area around a running jet engine is a literal death zone, but a civilian? They have no idea. Ground workers recognized the danger instantly. Several began waving their arms and screaming at him to stop. One ground crew member later recalled seeing debris and dust moving toward the intake and immediately realizing Emeka was heading into the engine hazard zone. According to the official investigation, he crossed into the marked danger zone while still looking back at the officers behind him. Witnesses saw his clothing begin to flap violently in the massive rush of airflow. He appeared to stumble, trying to regain his footing, but instead of moving away from the engine, he took one more step forward, and that single step proved fatal. Within seconds, the overwhelming suction pulled him off balance and straight into the intake. Ground crews scrambled to radio an emergency, and the pilots immediately initiated an engine shutdown, but there was no time to stop it. The entire horrific incident lasted less than 10 seconds. Airport firefighters and medics rushed to the scene within moments, but the injuries were catastrophic. Emeka was pronounced dead right there on the tarmac. Investigators didn't find anything wrong with the plane or the engine. It was operating completely normally, and all the safety lines on the ground were perfectly up to code. Instead, the investigation focused on how a detainee managed to break free in an active aircraft area in the first place. The final report slammed the escort procedures, noting a massive lack of personnel and zero contingency planning for what to do if someone tried to run. And as usual with these corporate investigations, the rules changed after the tragedy. New regulations came down, demanding more guards and stricter separations between detainees and active aircraft. In the end, Emeka spent 7 years trying to build a life in Britain. But on the day he was supposed to leave, a desperate, panicked attempt to avoid boarding a plane brought him into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The aircraft eventually departed for Lagos later that afternoon. It was March 2017 in Gary, Indiana. The city had been a steel town for over a century, the mills and foundries defining the skyline along the lake for miles. Stacks, yards, rail lines, and processing facilities running in a stretch that smelled like sulfur and hot metal on warm days. Work there was physical, loud, and unforgiving. Mervyn Schaub had been a furnace floor supervisor at the foundry for 9 years. He was 51 and had built a reputation for knowing the floor well, but over time, he had begun using that experience as a reason to skip procedures rather than follow them. He had not completed a mandatory equipment recertification in 14 months, proved ladle transfers beyond manufacturer weight ratings when production was behind, and had repeatedly overruled equipment concerns raised by the crane operator without ordering an inspection. Ladle number 3, a transfer vessel rated for a maximum of 8.5 tons of molten aluminum, had been flagged twice by the crane operator for a hairline crack along the lower trunnion bracket. Mervyn signed off on continued use both times without calling an inspector. A floor hand later noticed aluminum oxide residue leaking from the bracket during a previous transfer and brought it to Mervyn's attention, but the residue was hosed down and dismissed as slag. On March 7th, the plant manager requested an updated equipment inspection log. Mervyn replied that all equipment was within operational parameters. On the morning of March 9th, Mervyn loaded ladle number 3 to 9.2 tons, 0.7 over its rated limit, to clear a backlogged pour order. 2 pour stations were operating simultaneously that morning, with a second team at pour station 1 preparing molds for the next sequence. The crane operator radioed twice during crane travel, reporting unusual resistance in the trolley system, and was told to keep moving. At 7:26 a.m., the floor hand noticed the lower trunnion bracket visibly flexing during travel and moved behind the furnace housing at 55 feet. At 7:28 a.m., the crane operator brought the ladle to a stop above Pour Station 2 at 22 feet. 3 assigned workers were at their positions directly below. The trunnion bracket failed at 7:29 a.m. The lower left side fractured completely, tilting the ladle approximately 40 degrees within 1 second and releasing the majority of 9.2 tons of molten aluminum at 1,560 degrees Fahrenheit onto the Pour Station floor. The moisture in the concrete surface vaporized on contact, driving a steam explosion that pushed molten material outward in a radius of approximately 25 feet, crossing into the adjacent Pour Station 1, where the second team had been preparing molds. Workers at both stations were within the splatter radius. The ladle continued tilting over the next 4 seconds as the crane operator killed crane power. Secondary splatter reached the furnace control panel, wiring at the edge of the pour zone, and ignited it. The crane operator in the cab at 22 feet saw the brackets separate and the ladle begin tilting before he could intervene. The floor hand, behind the furnace housing at 55 feet, saw the floor flash at the pour station and felt a wave of radiant heat reach his position. The workers at Furnace 2 on the far side of the bay observed the splatter pattern cross the floor toward Pour Station 1 and move behind their equipment housing. The workers below ladle number 3 and those caught in the splatter radius at the adjacent pour station did not survive. Their bodies were recovered from the pour stations after the molten material cooled sufficiently for entry, a process that took several hours. The crane operator remained in the cab until the pour zone was confirmed clear. The floor hand was treated on site for radiant heat burns to his forearms and the back of his neck, consistent with his position behind the furnace housing during the spill. The equipment concerned forms the crane operator had submitted on 2 separate occasions were recovered from facility records during the investigation. Both had been signed and dismissed by Mervyn Schaub without a follow-up inspection being ordered. The ladle's trunnion bracket showed a pre-existing fracture line consistent with the crack the crane operator had originally flagged. The pour order authorization confirmed the transfer had been loaded to 9.2 tons against a rated maximum of 8.5. Mervyn Schaub did not survive. Liability for the incident was assigned to the supervisory decisions made on the morning of March 9th and to the pattern of dismissed maintenance concerns in the weeks prior. The foundry was cited for multiple equipment and oversight violations. It was November the 19th, 2017, along a commercial fishing pier on the Oregon coast, where early morning fog hung low over the water and wind gusts were already reaching 30 miles per hour. The weathered wooden structure extended 200 feet into the harbor, lined with mooring cleats and electrical hookups for the small charter boats that operated from the facility. Storm warnings had been issued for later that day, with conditions expected to deteriorate rapidly as a Pacific front moved inland. Orion Cade, a 42-year-old charter boat captain, had arrived before dawn to prepare his vessel for what would likely be the last fishing trip before the weather turned dangerous. He operated on narrow profit margins, making every available day on the water crucial for his livelihood. Cade was known for his meticulous preparation and conservative approach to safety, traits that had kept him incident-free during 15 years of coastal fishing operations. Cade had recently ended a tumultuous 3-year relationship with Evan Pike, a dock worker in his mid-30s who also kept a small sailboat at the harbor. The breakup had been contentious, with disputes over shared property and accusations of infidelity. Pike had been ordered by the court to stay at least 100 yards away from Cade, following incidents of harassment and threatening phone calls. Pike had violated the restraining order multiple times, showing up at locations where Cade was known to dock and leaving hostile messages on his boat. Text messages recovered later from Pike's phone contained threats about making Cade regret the breakup and references to ensuring he understood the consequences of his actions. That morning, Cade was working alone on his 24-foot fishing boat, preparing nets and checking equipment while the vessel remained tied to the pier. The boat's engine was idling in preparation for departure, with the propeller intermittently engaged as wind and line tension affected the drivetrain. Security cameras mounted on nearby light poles captured Pike moving along the pier structure approximately 30 minutes before the incident occurred. Pike used a utility knife to cut through a secondary tension line that helped stabilize boats during high wind conditions. As the severed line released tension, the boat yawed sharply in the strengthening wind. The sudden lateral movement caused Cade to lose his footing on the wet deck. He stumbled toward the stern as the vessel lurched, unable to regain balance as the hull shifted beneath him. Cade fell overboard near the stern while the engine remained engaged at idle. His legs struck the rotating propeller as he entered the water, causing catastrophic lower limb trauma. Blood spread rapidly across the surface as he was forced briefly against the hull before slipping beneath the water. The boat continued to move erratically in the wind until the engine eventually stalled. Harbor Patrol responded to reports of an unmanned vessel drifting near the pier. Rescue divers recovered Cade's body 22 minutes after the initial emergency call, but he had already succumbed to blood loss and trauma from the propeller strike. The medical examiner determined that the combination of severe laceration and cold water exposure had caused rapid incapacitation. Investigators found the severed tension line and matched tool marks to equipment in Pike's possession. Security footage showed him in the area during the time frame when the sabotage occurred, clearly violating his restraining order. Pike initially denied involvement, but later admitted to cutting the line, claiming he only intended to inconvenience Cade. Phone records and witness statements contradicted Pike's claim. Harbor workers reported seeing Pike watching Cade's morning routine from a distance on previous days. Digital forensics revealed Pike had researched the pier's security camera blind spots in the weeks prior to the incident. Prosecutors argued that Pike's harassment and premeditated actions demonstrated reckless disregard for human life. Pike was charged with second-degree murder, but after plea negotiations, he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. The court determined that while Pike may not have specifically intended to kill Cade, he had deliberately created a dangerous situation knowing Cade would be aboard the vessel. He was sentenced to 15 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after serving 85% of his sentence. The case prompted new security measures at the harbor and stricter enforcement of restraining orders in maritime settings. It was June 3, 2018, at a downtown construction site in Seattle, Washington. Morning traffic moved slowly around the blocked-off streets where a new 40-story residential tower was rising. The tower crane, assigned to the project, stood high above the street, its long jib stretching across nearby rooftops. Inside the crane cab sat 35-year-old Kevin Walsh, a former military engineer who had spent most of his civilian life operating tower cranes across the region. Co-workers said he liked the structure and quiet of crane work. It kept his mind steady, even on the difficult days when his PTSD symptoms resurfaced. He lived alone in a small apartment outside the city, but he sent part of every paycheck to support his disabled veteran brother. Kevin arrived early that morning, as he did most days. He reviewed weather conditions, checked the crane's diagnostics, and logged his inspection notes. Strong winds had been forecast, and by sunrise, gusts were already reaching the lower limits of what the job allowed. The shutdown threshold was 50 miles per hour. Weather stations reported peaks around 45. The site supervisor walked through the morning briefing with tension in his voice. The project was behind schedule, and a group of investors planned to visit later that afternoon. Kevin knew the pressure, but he also knew the risks of high wind lifting. He agreed to operate but reduced the load weights and increased safety margins, hoping conditions would stabilize. By late morning, the wind had grown stronger. Flags around the site snapped hard, and dust moved in swirling bursts through the open floors of the rising structure. Kevin continued lifting smaller sections of steel to avoid unnecessary strain on the crane. On the ground, apprentice operator Lisa monitored the cab from her position near the base. She had been shadowing Kevin for several weeks and admired the way he worked. Slow, precise, careful with every adjustment. Around noon, Kevin was assigned to lift a bundle of long steel beams up to the 25th floor. It was the kind of lift he had done hundreds of times, but with the wind already rising, he took extra precautions. Before moving anything, he checked the anemometer mounted near the cab, then checked it again a few minutes later. Gusts were increasing, but still below the shutdown threshold. He radioed the signalman, confirmed the path was clear, and began the lift slowly to keep the beam steady. The load rose from the staging area, climbing through open air where the tower crane was more exposed. Halfway up, Kevin felt the machine shift beneath him. Wind at elevation often behaved differently from what ground level readings suggested, and as the beams reached mid-height, a strong gust struck them from the southwest. The bundle swung outward, pulled like a giant pendulum beneath the jib. On the ground, apprentice operator Lisa saw the swing develop almost instantly. The beams traveled in a long, smooth arc, far wider than any safe lift allowed. She shouted toward the nearest radio operator and motioned upward with both arms, trying to alert anyone who could reach Kevin. Several workers nearby backed away from the fall zone, dropping tools as the sway grew worse. Inside the cab, Kevin reacted fast. He eased the rotation controls, attempting to counter the swing by shifting the crane's orientation. His goal was to bleed energy from the moving load and realign it beneath the jib. But every adjustment took seconds to translate into movement, and the wind was shifting faster than the crane could respond. The beams began oscillating from side to side, each pass wider than the last. Then another gust hit, the strongest so far. The beams snapped outward again, pulling the jib past its normal operating angle. Kevin felt the entire upper assembly twist. The counterweight at the rear shifted abruptly as the crane's balance was disrupted. Metal groaned through the cab walls, the kind of deep, hollow sound operators dreaded. The tower swayed harder, no longer in a controlled arc, but in a slow, leaning motion that signaled the structure was moving beyond its limit. Lisa and several crew members screamed warnings, pointing toward the upper floors where the crane had begun to tip. Dust rose from the base support as bolts strained under the force. Kevin stayed at the controls, doing everything he could to bring the swinging beams back under control. He eased the rotation, adjusted the trolley, and tried to dump tension from the load, but the gusts were too strong and too fast. For a moment, the crane held still, leaning at an angle that wasn't normal but hadn't yet crossed into collapse. Then, a stronger burst of wind hit the suspended beams, pulling the jib far past its safe limit. The tower shifted. Bolts at the midsection groaned loudly, and the entire structure flexed in a way operators never wanted to feel. Lisa shouted from below, waving her arms and backing toward the edge of the site as the crane lurched. Kevin, knowing the crane was going over, unbuckled his harness and tried to reach the emergency ladder mounted behind the cab. He made it only a few steps. The upper tower suddenly jerked as the crane began to tip. The catwalk beneath Kevin shook violently, and he was thrown sideways. He lost his grip on the rail and slipped from the platform, falling along the outside of the tower as it tilted. Mid-fall, he collided with a steel support beam. The impact knocked the breath out of him, and as the crane continued to twist, one of the sheared lattice sections snapped downward, catching his left arm. The metal edge sliced through it. Kevin fell the remaining distance, nearly 40 feet, landing on a lower concrete floor of the unfinished building. Workers nearby heard the thud and scrambled to reach him, unaware that the crane itself was still collapsing overhead. Above them, the tower continued tipping toward the street. A section of the jib struck the edge of the building before breaking free entirely. Steel fragments cascaded downward, crushing scaffolding and scattering debris across the site. Lisa dove behind a concrete barrier as dust and metal rained down. A few pieces cleared the perimeter fencing and fell onto the sidewalk, hitting 2 parked cars but missing pedestrians. Emergency crews arrived within minutes. Firefighters blocked off the surrounding streets and directed people away from the dust cloud drifting across the intersection. Inside the half-built structure, paramedics followed workers to the floor where Kevin had landed. They found him unresponsive. Despite efforts to stabilize him, the combination of blunt force trauma from the fall and catastrophic blood loss from the severed arm left no possibility of survival. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. Crews also swept the base of the collapse zone and confirmed that no one on the street had been seriously injured. Lisa and several workers were evaluated for shock, but were physically unharmed. Kevin's death hit the crew hard. He was one of the most experienced operators on site, placed in a situation where the weather changed faster than the equipment could handle. The collapse forced the project to shut down indefinitely, and investigators began evaluating how wind at elevation had exceeded safe operating conditions that left Kevin with seconds to react and no way out. The investigation later showed that winds at the crane's height were far stronger than the readings taken at ground level. The gust that hit the suspended beam created forces no operator could counter. Regulators cited the company for continuing work despite unsafe wind conditions. The crane was dismantled, and the site stayed closed for weeks while engineers evaluated damage to the surrounding buildings. Co-workers said Kevin had done everything he could. He was a careful operator, caught in a situation where the schedule pushed forward, even as the weather shifted faster than anyone could react. It was February 2018 in Cushing, Oklahoma, a flat and windswept town at the center of one of the country's busiest pipeline networks. Crude oil infrastructure stretched in every direction, and radiographic weld inspection was a routine part of the work carried out along the outdoor pipeline corridors. Lauren Diebach had been a senior radiography technician for over 2 decades. He was 57, overconfident in the specific way that comes from years of doing something without consequence, the kind of man who treated his own experience as a substitute for procedure. He stored the Iridium 192 exposure device in an unlocked trailer cabinet instead of its certified shielded container, skipped source security checks at the end of shift, and had submitted inaccurate radiation monitoring badge logs more than once. His crew was small, a junior technician and a site safety monitor. The Iridium 192 source had an activity level of 100 curies, within legal limits for industrial radiographic work, but capable of causing acute radiation syndrome with unshielded exposure measured in minutes at close range. When fully retracted, the source sat inside a shielded chamber within the device. When the drive cable was extended, it moved outside that chamber and became active. A mechanical cable position indicator on the unit showed whether the source was seated, and it was known to stick in cold weather. The junior technician noticed on February 6th that the exposure device had been left in the unlocked trailer cabinet overnight and mentioned it to Lauren, who said the certified container took too long to cycle in cold weather. On February 9th, the site safety monitor flagged inaccurate badge log entries to the safety office. Lauren resubmitted corrected-looking figures without explanation. On February 12th, the trailer was left unlocked overnight by a site laborer. No crew member was notified. On the morning of February 13th, Lauren began setup without verifying that the source was fully retracted inside the exposure unit. The junior technician arrived at 6:44 a.m. and noticed the drive cable appeared slightly extended, an indicator the source may not be fully seated. Lauren told him the indicator stuck in cold weather and instructed him to set up the shielding barriers. The site safety monitor arrived at 6:55 a.m. and positioned the boundary markers 150 feet from the work area. At 7:02 a.m., Lauren handed the device to the junior technician to carry to the first weld inspection point. Neither was wearing a dosimeter badge. The junior technician carried the device at his side approximately 8 inches from his right hip for the 200-foot walk to the weld point, with Lauren following 6 feet behind. The walk took approximately 4 minutes. At the weld point, Lauren took the device and spent 3 minutes connecting it to the guide tube with bare hands, fingers within 4 to 6 inches of the partially unretracted source. The junior technician stood at 3 feet during the process. The site safety monitor remained at the boundary marker throughout. No symptoms were felt by either man. Both completed a full 8-hour shift. The exposure was invisible, silent, and caused no physical sensation detectable to anyone on site. 4 days after February 13th, the junior technician reported nausea and noticed redness developing along his right hip, thigh, and the back of his right hand, the areas closest to the device during the carry. Lauren Diebach reported the same symptoms 2 days later, nausea and reddening across both palms from handling the exposure unit directly. Both were pulled from site work and admitted to a regional medical facility for evaluation. The site safety monitor reported nothing, consistent with her distance throughout the day. Dosimetry reconstruction placed both men's absorbed doses within the range associated with acute radiation syndrome. The junior technician's localized exposure to his hand and hip was the higher of the two. Lauren's was distributed across his palms and torso. The junior technician was transferred to a specialist facility and required months of treatment for radiation injury to his hand and hip, including surgical intervention. He did not return to work in the field. Lorne Diebach died 11 weeks after the exposure from complications of acute radiation syndrome. His organ systems had sustained damage inconsistent with recovery at the dose levels reconstruction had placed him within. The exposure device was found to have a drive cable retraction failure, the same issue the junior technician had flagged the morning it was used. Lorne Diebach was identified as the responsible party for the storage failures, the badge log submissions, and the decision to proceed without verifying source position. The contracting company was cited for radiological safety violations across multiple categories. The case was closed without criminal charges. It was August 14, 2017 in the South China Sea, about 30 nautical miles west of Sarangani province. The sea stayed unusually calm through the night, while diesel fumes and rotting bait hung over the deck of the Maricel MB. Crewmen later said the calm weather made everyone less alert during the early morning haul. Ferdinand "Ferdy" Laxa was 34 years old and one of the more experienced crewmen aboard the Maricel MB. He started commercial fishing at 16 after leaving school in General Santos City to help support his family. Over the years, he learned the rules fishermen depended on to survive. Never stand inside loose-line coils, never trust a wet deck, and never put a hand near an active hauler. The Maricel MB used a hydraulic line hauler to pull thousands of baited hooks from the water under extreme tension. And honestly, once something gets caught in those rollers, the machine can pull a person in faster than anyone nearby can react. That trip had already gone longer than planned because the captain was trying to fill the freezing hold before the ice supply spoiled. The crew had been hauling lines for nearly 14 hours with little rest. Several men later admitted they had slept less than 3 hours total since leaving port 2 days earlier. The deckhand assigned to monitor the safety lock had reportedly been struggling to stay awake since sunrise. And for me, that part really matters, because once crews get exhausted out there, small mistakes stop getting noticed until something goes seriously wrong. At about 7:22 a.m., a yellowfin tuna weighing more than 180 pounds surfaced beside the vessel, tangled deep inside several branch lines near the hydraulic hauler. The fish twisted violently against the gear, causing loops of line to jam inside the rollers. Clearing tangles by hand was dangerous, but still common on older fishing boats, because shutting the entire system down slowed production. Ferdy stepped beside the hauler, wearing rubber boots and cut-resistant gloves soaked with seawater and fish blood. Witnesses later told Coast Guard investigators he leaned toward the tangled line while calling for the safety lock to be engaged. The deckhand responsible for the lock had drifted asleep near the rail. The hydraulic hauler suddenly regained tension. Crewmen later said the sound changed first, from a slow, grinding pull into a sharp, metallic whine as the line tightened. Ferdy's right sleeve caught inside the spinning rollers before he could pull free. The machine yanked his upper body sideways into the housing. The line tension tore his right arm completely off at the shoulder almost instantly. Several crewmen nearby were sprayed with blood as the severed arm disappeared overboard, still attached to the fishing line. And from what I researched, this is exactly why fishermen stay away from active haulers. Because once the rollers grab part of your body, there's almost no time for anyone nearby to stop it. Ferdy collapsed backward onto the deck while blood pumped heavily from the exposed shoulder cavity. One fisherman tied a bait rag around the wound as a tourniquet, while another used canvas tarps to keep him from sliding across the wet deck. The captain radioed maritime emergency responders, requesting medical evacuation. The nearest rescue helicopter was unavailable, forcing another aircraft to be dispatched from farther along the coast. Crewmen later estimated it arrived nearly 4 hours later after repeated updates reporting severe blood loss and worsening condition. And this is the brutal part about accidents at sea. Even when everybody does the right thing afterward, help can still be hours away. By then, Ferdy had turned pale gray and was barely breathing. He stopped responding and died 20 minutes before the helicopter arrived. The post-mortem examination determined the cause of death was catastrophic blood loss caused by complete traumatic amputation of the right arm at the shoulder. The hydraulic rollers destroyed major blood vessels and tore muscle away from the chest wall. The Maritime Industry Authority later cited the vessel for safety violations involving fatigue management and improper lockout procedures during hauling operations. Investigators concluded the machine should have been fully disengaged before any manual clearing work began. Ferdy's family received compensation equal to about 2 months of wages and signed a settlement agreement without legal assistance. It was just after midnight on February 7, 2014, at an airport in Malaysia. The rain had stopped, but low mist still hung over the wet runway. Out on that tarmac was 44-year-old Hafiz Karim. He wasn't some rookie. He'd been in airfield operations for 10 years after a stint in the Army. According to his family, Hafiz was one of those old-school guys who was careful to a fault, the kind of guy whose attention to detail probably annoyed the younger staff. But he never cut corners. He had a spotless record, a wife who taught public school, and a 17-year-old son, Paolo. His job that night was a routine inspection of the runway. Now, routine is a dangerous word in aviation. Whenever you hear that a job was routine, that's usually exactly when things are about to go sideways. This runway was 3,000 meters long, and it handled everything. If you were on it, you had to be visible. Hafiz hopped into airfield vehicle number 3, a white pickup with an amber flashing light, and radioed the tower at 12 o'clock in the morning to start his check. 5 minutes later, things got complicated. A cargo plane, an ATR-72, had to divert. It wasn't an emergency, just an unscheduled arrival. Here is where the breakdown happened, and it's a classic, tragic case of people assuming too much. The tower controller knew Hafiz was out there, but assumed he was already clearing the runway. Hafiz never gave an exact location, and the controller never asked. And as I've been looking back at the files, I saw 2 seasoned professionals just guessing instead of checking, all while a massive plane is moving forward. Meanwhile, Hafiz spotted something on the tarmac, perhaps a broken reflector or a stray piece of debris. He stopped his truck right there on the dark asphalt, left his single amber beacon flashing, and stepped out into the night with a flashlight to investigate. Then, at exactly 12:10 a.m., air traffic control cleared the incoming cargo plane to land. Put yourself in the cockpit. The pilots are staring down at a wet, glistening runway. Glare is everywhere, with dozens of intense airport lights bleeding across the pavement. From their view, they aren't scanning the asphalt for a rogue pickup truck. They are locked into their instruments, monitoring their airspeed, checking their alignment, and preparing for the slick braking conditions ahead. In a sea of flashing airfield markers, the truck's lone amber beacon didn't look like a hazard. It blended perfectly into the background noise of the airport grid. And because the truck was completely stationary, right near the center line, there was no lateral movement to trigger the pilot's instincts. It was a fatal optical illusion. Only after the heavy ATR touched down, when the aircraft's powerful landing lights finally cut through the glare, did the crew realize the terrifying truth. That amber light wasn't a runway marker, it was a vehicle. But by then, the aircraft was fully committed to its landing roll, hurtling down the center line too fast to stop and closing the gap in seconds. The crew slammed on the brakes and threw the engines into full reverse, but you cannot negotiate with momentum. The plane plowed into the pickup truck at highway speed, instantly obliterating the left side of the vehicle. The violent impact spun the truck like a top, sending a wall of shredded steel flying through the air. Hafiz, turning toward the deafening roar of the engines a second too late, was struck by the debris and thrown onto the wet pavement. Airport firefighters arrived on the scene in just 4 minutes. The flight crew was badly shaken, but alive. The truck was a mountain of unrecognizable scrap metal, and Hafiz lay unresponsive near the center line. The medical examiner's report was grim: massive internal trauma, a crushed chest, and a torn major artery. When the investigators looked into it, they didn't find any mechanical failures. It was a runway incursion caused entirely by bad communication. The controller thought the truck was leaving. Hafiz thought the runway was protected. No one checked. No charges were ever filed. After the accident, the airport changed the rules, demanding exact GPS-like position reports instead of vague guesses. Hafiz's co-workers started a scholarship fund in his honor. It was June 3rd, 2016, in a sprawling freight yard outside a small Kansas town where the summer heat had already begun settling into the rail steel by mid-morning. The facility stretched across 40 acres of switching tracks and loading platforms, where massive rail cars sat in long rows waiting to be repositioned for the next shipment. Merrick Boyd, a 38-year-old safety coordinator, had driven out early that Friday to conduct his weekly compliance inspection before the weekend audit. Boyd was methodical by nature, a trait developed during his years as an Army logistics specialist before transitioning to civilian railroad work. His job involved enforcing written safety procedures that many longtime workers viewed as unnecessary bureaucracy. He carried a clipboard and digital camera, documenting violations that could result in hefty federal fines. Most employees tolerated his presence, understanding the regulatory necessity, but a few saw him as an outsider, disrupting their established routines. 3 weeks earlier, Boyd had filed a formal report against Caleb Rourke, a 41-year-old veteran equipment operator who had been disabling safety interlocks to speed up switching operations. The violation cost Rourke his overtime privileges and damaged his informal leadership status among the crew. Text messages recovered later from Rourke's phone contained warnings for Boyd to stay clear of moving equipment, though investigators would determine these were sent after working hours when both men had left the facility. The morning inspection proceeded normally until Boyd reached the eastern section, where 2 freight cars sat positioned roughly 28 inches apart on parallel tracks. Security cameras captured him walking between the stationary cars, checking brake mechanisms and coupling hardware as required by his checklist. Boyd was foul of the track, positioned within a narrow temporary maintenance spacing used during switching operations, where all equipment movement was required to be locked out. The freight cars themselves were massive steel containers, each weighing over 80 tons when fully loaded with grain shipments destined for coastal ports. Their coupling systems required precise alignment, and the hydraulic brake mechanisms were designed to hold them stationary, even on slight inclines. Boyd had performed this same inspection routine dozens of times without incident, following protocols established after previous accidents at similar facilities across the Midwest. Minutes earlier, a shunting engine remained coupled to the cars and under remote control, with the air brake system fully charged and capable of movement on command. From a remote locomotive control console inside the operations building, Rourke deliberately initiated a brief forward movement command. The rail car lurched forward faster than Rourke had anticipated, closing the gap in under 3 seconds. Boyd was caught chest first between the steel surfaces. Multiple ribs were fractured immediately, puncturing both lungs as the pressure continued. His pelvis and upper thighs were crushed as the weight of the loaded car pressed against him. Blood began pooling beneath the rail before the emergency stop system finally engaged. The security footage would later show his final moments lasted less than 30 seconds from initial impact to complete stillness. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the automated distress signal, but Boyd was pronounced dead at the scene. Control system logs showed the movement command had been activated during a designated exclusion period when personnel were known to be conducting inspections in that section. Phone records revealed deleted text messages that were later recovered through digital forensics. The investigation would reveal that Boyd had been planning to recommend additional safety measures following the upcoming audit. Rourke admitted to investigators that he believed a brief movement would intimidate Boyd without causing harm. Federal railroad safety officials concluded that the fatal compression would not have occurred without the deliberate activation during the restricted time frame. Rourke was charged with involuntary manslaughter with a retaliatory motive and cited by federal investigators for willful violations of railroad safety regulations tied to the unauthorized equipment movement. It was August 14, 2017 at a logging site outside Medan, North Sumatra, Indonesia. Overnight rain left the ground wet and unstable, while fresh-cut acacia covered the clearing with sawdust and damp wood chips. Workers later said the trees felt unusually heavy that morning, enough to strain chainsaw engines during long cuts. Artie Santoso was 38 years old and had worked logging jobs across North Sumatra for nearly 2 decades. He cleared farmland and secondary forest for small contractors paid by the hectare. Co-workers trusted him because he understood how trees shifted during cuts and rarely made mistakes handling difficult trunks. What surprised me while researching this is how much experience chainsaw work actually takes. A logger isn't just cutting wood. They're constantly trying to predict how the tree will react once the blade goes in. Artie used a gasoline chainsaw with a 20-inch guide bar, but safety gear on rural logging sites was limited. He wore gloves and rubber boots that day, but had no face shield or neck protection. And after years of doing the same work, a lot of loggers stop thinking about missing gear unless something has already gone wrong. His wife, Sari, had recently given birth to their 3rd child, so Artie had been accepting every extra job he could get to help pay the hospital bills. And like a lot of fathers in situations like this, he saw the extra work as a blessing. Around 11:20 a.m., Artie was cutting through a large acacia trunk that had already been felled earlier that morning. His partner, Denny, walked back toward the truck to refill fuel and grab drinking water. Artie stayed behind to finish one final cut before lunch, while the chainsaw echoed through the clearing in short bursts. And I can't believe how unlucky that decision is. Because if he only take a lunch first, maybe the outcome would be different. Artie was cutting through the acacia trunk at full throttle when the chainsaw suddenly struck something solid buried inside the wood. Investigators later discovered it was a rusted iron boundary spike hidden beneath years of tree growth. The impact caused the saw to kick violently sideways toward his body. The chain tore through Artie's left forearm before striking the right side of his neck and lower jaw. The injury happened in less than a second, which really shows how unforgiving chainsaw kickbacks are once the blade loses control. Blood sprayed across the trunk and nearby grass while the chainsaw dropped beside him, still running. Investigators later believed he remained standing briefly before collapsing against a smaller tree nearby. And for me, this is the hardest part of this story. Knowing he was still alive for several minutes after the kickback, fully aware of how badly he had been injured. When Denny returned about 4 minutes later, after noticing the chainsaw had gone silent, he found Artie sitting against the trunk with one hand pressed against his neck, while blood soaked through his shirt and gloves. Denny called a nearby village health worker and tried wrapping a towel around the wound, but Artie lost consciousness before help arrived. Because the logging site was deep in the hills, the health worker and 2 responders did not reach the area for another 18 minutes by motorcycle. By then, severe blood loss had already caused cardiac arrest. Responders attempted CPR, but Artie was pronounced dead before transport to the provincial hospital. The post-mortem examination found fatal neck trauma and massive blood loss caused by the chainsaw kickback. Doctors reported the main artery on the right side of Artie's neck had been nearly severed, while cuts on his left forearm suggested he instinctively tried blocking the blade. Investigators later recovered a heavily rusted iron boundary spike buried inside the acacia trunk beneath years of growth. Officials stated that older roadside trees in the region often contained hidden nails, wire, and metal debris, but smaller logging crews rarely had access to detection equipment. Workers later admitted they usually relied on experience alone when cutting older trees because scanning tools were too expensive for small operations. And for me, this is what makes logging work so dangerous, because sometimes the thing that kills you is buried deep inside the tree long before the chainsaw ever touches it. It was November 8, 2015, at a petrochemical facility on the east side of Baytown, Texas. The sun had just begun rising over the refinery towers, and steam drifted from the stacks in the early morning air. Inside the plant, the first shift was moving through its usual rounds, checking gauges, pumps, and pressure lines before production increased for the day. Among the technicians on duty was 31-year-old David Rodriguez, a third-generation refinery worker whose father and grandfather had both spent most of their lives at the same facility. David had recently been promoted to senior technician after completing night school chemistry courses. He was engaged to his high school sweetheart and often picked up extra shifts so they could save for a house. Co-workers described him as someone who followed procedures exactly and kept thorough notes during every inspection. He took pride in continuing the family tradition, but he also understood the risks, especially in a plant with older equipment and an aging infrastructure that required constant monitoring. One part of the facility, Reactor Unit 3, had been giving workers trouble for weeks. Its pressure readings would spike and drop at strange times, never high enough to trigger an automatic shutdown, but inconsistent enough that technicians knew something wasn't quite right. Several pipes in the unit had also begun to vibrate more than usual during peak production hours. These weren't violent movements, just small shakes that experienced workers recognized as early signs of internal stress or developing corrosion. David documented every irregularity he found. He photographed gauges, logged timestamps, and forwarded detailed reports to his supervisors. Each submission resulted in the same outcome. The unit stayed online. Shutting down a reactor was expensive and time-consuming, and with production quotas tight that month, management preferred to keep the equipment running unless the readings forced a shutdown. That morning, David wasn't alone. He had been assigned to train Miguel, a new technician in his first month on the job. Miguel followed closely with a clipboard, copying readings and asking steady questions about pipe temperatures, pressure cycles, and what counted as normal vibration. David moved at a patient pace. He remembered how overwhelming the refinery felt on a first day, and he made sure Miguel understood why each check mattered. Their task was routine. Walk the length of reactor unit 3, inspect gauges, look for leaks, listen for unusual sounds, and log everything for the engineering team. David had done this route countless times, but as they approached the pressure manifold, he felt a stronger vibration through the steel walkway. At first, he assumed it was part of the usual warm-up cycle, but this movement felt different, more focused, more rhythmic, as if something inside the pipe system was shifting unevenly. He stopped and placed a hand on a support rail. The metal trembled in a pattern that matched the vibration beneath them. Miguel waited beside him, sensing that something was off. The gauges nearby showed normal numbers. Nothing appeared out of range. But experienced technicians often relied on instinct just as much as instruments, and the vibration had grown stronger than what David remembered from the previous week. Before he escalated the issue, he wanted one more complete set of readings. Gauge delays were common, and pumps could cause temporary fluctuations that disappeared within minutes. He asked Miguel to note the pressure levels while he examined the connections more closely. As he leaned in toward the manifold, a faint metallic tapping echoed from inside the line, a small, irregular sound that didn't register on any panel. It suggested internal stress, the kind that technicians learned to recognize long before alarms went off. David paused, realizing he might be moments away from calling in a shutdown, but before making that decision, he aimed to confirm exactly what was happening, hoping the vibration was stabilizing rather than escalating. A sharp metallic crack came from the pipe, followed by a burst of high-pressure spray. The ruptured section released a jet of benzene that struck David directly. Miguel saw him react instantly. His body jerked backward, and his arms lifted as the chemical soaked through his protective suit. He stumbled, tried to brace himself, then collapsed onto the walkway. Miguel rushed forward but slipped on the growing pool of liquid and fell to his knees. Realizing he couldn't reach David safely, he pushed himself back toward the doorway and ran to alert nearby workers. Emergency alarms sounded throughout the unit, and responders activated the chemical containment protocol, sealing the area and shutting down nearby pumps. A specialized rescue team reached David within minutes, but the exposure had already caused severe chemical burns and internal poisoning. He was transported to a medical facility on site and then transferred to a hospital where he died a few hours later due to the extent of toxic absorption and thermal injury caused by the ruptured line. Miguel survived with minor chemical burns, but he developed long-term respiratory issues from inhaling fumes during the incident. He never returned to work at the plant. Investigators later found that the ruptured pipe had severe internal corrosion in a section that had never been replaced during earlier maintenance cycles. The wall had thinned so much that even a minor pressure change was enough to blow it open. The final report cited poor upkeep, ignored warnings, and delayed repairs as the main factors behind the failure. Reactor Unit 3 remained offline for 3 months, while aging lines were replaced, monitoring systems upgraded, and staff retrained on chemical handling procedures. Regulators issued multiple safety violations, noting that David had reported irregularities well before the rupture. When the unit eventually restarted, many workers still saw the incident as entirely preventable, a loss that happened not because procedures were ignored, but because a technician who followed every rule was failed by the system around him. It was March 14, 2015, at an airport in Atlanta, Georgia. Above ground, passengers waited for delayed flights and watched luggage circle baggage claim. Beneath the terminal, conveyor belts ran through narrow service tunnels. And that day, a 51-year-old guy named Hollis Jacobs clocked into work down there. Hollis was a veteran, 24 years on the job. He was just a regular guy who kept his head down, drove an old truck, and had a picture of his beagle, Rusty, taped inside his locker. According to the reports, he'd been divorced for a while, didn't see his kids much, and spent his weekends fishing alone. He wasn't a boss, and passengers never saw him, but he was the guy who kept the place moving. That night, Hollis was assigned to Bay 7. A guide rail was acting up and jamming bags, which was a known issue that week. Workers had already cleared several temporary blockages during previous shifts, and most only required a quick adjustment before operations resumed. The fix itself wasn't complicated, but the setup was dangerous. Right below the rail was a massive drive roller, a classic pinch point where the heavy belt met the metal frame. If anything got caught in there, it wasn't going to stop. Here's where things went wrong. Hollis was supposed to use a lockout padlock to completely kill the power to the belt before working on it. It's safety 101. He actually signed out the lock, but according to the reports, he never used it. Maybe he was in a hurry, or maybe he thought the job would only take 2 seconds. Investigators later found the lock sitting right there in his jacket pocket. At 11:41 that night, Hollis radioed that he was checking under the housing. The jam had already cleared, and bags were moving normally again. According to investigators, supervisors believed Hollis was only performing a quick inspection to confirm the guide rail was aligned properly before the system returned to full operation. A few minutes later, another minor backup began forming upstream. With flights still arriving and luggage starting to stack up, a supervisor monitoring the control screens believed the repair work was finished and authorized the belt network to resume normal speed. Nobody actually checked to confirm Hollis had exited the tunnel or removed himself from the machinery. The second the power kicked back on, tragedy hit. Hollis was crouched right next to that roller, and his heavy jacket sleeve got sucked in. It pulled his right arm forward instantly. Looking at the scene later, investigators found scrape marks where Hollis desperately braced himself with his left hand, trying to fight the machine and pull away. But you can't outmuscle industrial machinery. The roller dragged his arm in deeper, fracturing and dislocating his shoulder, and slammed his chest hard against the steel frame. He didn't get pulled all the way through. Instead, he got wedged tightly between the roller and the metal housing. For me, this is the worst part of the case. The jam wasn't big enough to trigger an automatic shutdown. The belts just kept grinding away around him. Down there, the noise is deafening. Another worker thought they heard a weird mechanical thud, but shrugged it off as a heavy suitcase hitting a rail. Right above Hollis's head, oblivious passengers were grabbing their bags from Carousel 7 while he was trapped in the dark underneath them. By 5:10 a.m., the next shift realized Hollis never signed out. They found him a few minutes later, but it was far too late. The medical examiner said he died from traumatic crush injuries and asphyxia. Essentially, the machine pinned his chest so hard he couldn't breathe, and he bled out. Those bruises on his left hand showed he fought like hell until the very end. In the end, OSHA cited the contractor for safety violations, but no one faced criminal charges. For reasons never fully explained, the case never went public, and the company quietly paid out a settlement to Hollis's family. A week later, maintenance finally replaced that faulty guide rail. It took them less than an hour. When they cleaned out Hollis's locker, his padlock was still in his coat. It's a brutal reminder of how a single skipped safety step can cost everything. It was August 2017 in Port Arthur, Texas, a Gulf Coast city known for its dense corridor of oil processing facilities, storage tanks, and pipelines along the waterway. Shutdown maintenance windows were common there, and the crews assigned to them were expected to move quickly. The crew lead had worked in refinery maintenance for years and had developed a reputation for rushing shutdown jobs while treating safety procedures as obstacles rather than requirements. Gas monitor calibrations were often skipped, standby positions were reassigned, and isolation permits were sometimes signed before every valve had been confirmed locked out. Over time, the crew had stopped pushing back. The wastewater treatment unit processed sulfur-containing water from the refinery's crude distillation units. During normal operation, settling Pond 3 was continuously agitated by mechanical mixers that prevented hydrogen sulfide from accumulating at the surface. The partial shutdown had stopped agitation to Pond 3 11 hours before the crew lead's crew arrived. And over those 11 hours, hydrogen sulfide accumulated in a ground-level layer above the pond and migrated into the adjacent below-grade valve access pit, a 6-foot-deep, open-top enclosure with no natural airflow and a single, fixed descent ladder. At concentrations above 500 parts per million, hydrogen sulfide causes loss of consciousness within 1 to 2 breaths and death within minutes. A crew member asked the crew lead at 5:45 a.m. whether a gas clearance check had been completed at the valve pit. The crew lead told him the area had been cleared by the night shift. A second crew member checked the shutdown handover sheet and found no gas clearance sign-off for the valve pit. He He showed it to the crew lead, who told him the pond clearance covered the pit and initialed the sheet himself. The crew lead powered on the portable H2S monitor, but moved the crew to the work area before the mandatory warm-up and calibration cycle completed, leaving the monitor running on the tailgate of the work truck 80 feet away. At 6:02 a.m., the crew arrived at the valve pit. The crew lead designated Al Schreffler, 41, to descend and open the manual isolation valve. A second crew member, Ray Demko, 34, had already positioned himself on the ladder to assist with tool handoff, 2 rungs down from the surface with his upper body still above the pit edge. No gas reading had been taken before either man entered the pit threshold. Al Schreffler descended past Ray Demko and stepped onto the pit floor. He lost consciousness within 1 to 2 breaths and went down without a sound. Ray Demko, 2 rungs above, felt the dizziness hit within seconds and lost his grip on the ladder. He fell into the pit and landed on the floor beside Al. Neither moved. The crew lead called both names from the pit edge. No response. The first crew member moved toward the ladder, and the crew lead grabbed his arm and pulled him back. The second crew member, standing approximately 15 feet upwind, identified a strong, rotten egg odor and told the crew lead. The crew lead stepped back from the edge and instructed the crew to move to an upwind position 30 feet away. The portable H2S monitor on the truck tailgate had by then completed its calibration cycle and was alarming. The second crew member could see the alarm indicator light from his position. Al Schreffler and Ray Demko were both visible on the pit floor below, motionless. Al Schreffler and Ray Demko did not survive. Both were recovered from the pit floor by a confined space rescue team with supplied air breathing equipment. The shutdown handover sheet recovered during the investigation showed no gas clearance sign-off for the valve pit. The H2S monitor log confirmed the device had not completed its calibration cycle before the crew moved to the work area. The isolation permit carried the crew lead's initials over the second crew member's written notation regarding the missing clearance sign-off. The crew lead was identified as the responsible party for the skipped calibration, the unsigned clearance, and the decision to send workers into the pit without a gas reading or staged rescue equipment. The case was ruled an industrial accident. No criminal charges were filed. The refinery was cited for confined space entry violations and failures in its shutdown handover process. It was June 22, 2017, at an airport in Dubai. Even after sunset, the heat still hung over the cargo apron as crews rushed through their final checks after a delayed shipment put the operation behind schedule. Caught in the middle of all that pressure was Tariq Manzoor. He was 29 years old, from Pakistan, and had been working in Dubai on a labor contract for 2 years. Like so many guys out there, he wasn't doing this for himself. Most of his paycheck went straight back home to support his parents and pay for his younger brother Imran's college tuition in Lahore. Tariq wasn't some careless worker cutting corners. His co-workers knew him as quiet, precise, and sharp. In fact, his contract was ending in just 3 months, and he'd already bought gifts to take home. And personally, it's just devastating to think about how close he was to the finish line. That night, the plane was a dedicated cargo freighter heading to Frankfurt. You have to understand, the cargo deck of a freighter is built for pallets, heavy nets, and metal tie-downs, not human beings. There are no passenger windows, no call buttons, no inside door handles, and absolutely no way to talk to the cockpit once the door is sealed. It is a giant, windowless metal box. Loading started late because a shipment from Bahrain was delayed. At 9:57 p.m., Tariq was sent into the belly of the plane to fix some heavy cargo bags that had shifted. It was an ordinary task, but the timing was terrible. Just a few minutes later, Tariq's supervisor got called away to another plane. At 10:08 p.m., the final sweep of the area was done. But here's the kicker. Nobody did a verbal head count. The crew outside just assumed Tariq had already climbed down the ladder. At 10:10 p.m., the massive cargo door slammed shut, and 11 minutes later, the plane pushed back. This part makes your stomach drop. You've got a team of people right outside, and not one person thinks to ask, "Where is Tariq?" Investigators later found fresh dents and scratch marks on the inside of the cargo door and wall panels. They even found a freight hook lying nearby. Tariq knew immediately what had happened. He beat on that door with everything he had, but between the sealed fuselage, the roaring jet engines, and the distance to the ground crew, nobody heard a thing. His phone records showed he tried to make call after call as the plane taxied away, but none connected. Once that plane lifted off into the sky, the thick metal hull and the altitude killed his signal completely. At 10:47 p.m., the plane departed for Frankfurt with Tariq trapped inside. The flight lasted nearly 7 hours. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, conditions inside the cargo compartment became increasingly hostile. Although the area remained pressurized, it was never designed to safely accommodate a person for an entire intercontinental flight. Isolated from the crew, exposed to cold temperatures, and trapped in complete darkness, Tariq did everything he could to stay alive. He dragged cargo bags together to create a barrier against the cold metal walls and wrapped himself in spare packing material he found nearby. Phone records showed repeated attempts to unlock his device until shortly after midnight, when all activity completely stopped. Investigators believe he remained conscious for some time, but prolonged exposure, exhaustion, dehydration, and the extreme stress of the situation gradually overwhelmed him. To me, it is terrifying to realize his final moments were spent trapped in total darkness, completely alone, with no way to call for help while the world passed by miles below. At some point during the flight, he lost consciousness and never recovered. When the plane landed in Frankfurt before dawn, the ground crew opened the cargo doors and immediately noticed that several cargo bags had been repositioned. They climbed inside and found Tariq unresponsive near the rear section of the compartment. Paramedics were called, but there was nothing they could do. The autopsy concluded he died from complications related to prolonged exposure after being trapped inside the aircraft for the entire flight, a completely preventable accident blamed on rushed loading and zero headcount checks. To me, this is the most devastating part of the entire story. No one faced criminal charges, but the contractor quietly settled out of court, following the classic corporate playbook of paying off the family, fixing the rulebook, and moving on. The airport finally mandated headcount checks, and Tariq's brother used the settlement money to graduate from college, later finding a receipt among Tariq's things for gifts he never got to deliver. It was March 3, 2017, in Jamshedpur, India. Inside a steel factory, the foundry floor was already hot, with furnace heat building inside the casting bay, while fine steel dust settled across the railings, walkways, and control stations. Workers moved between the pouring platforms as production continued through the morning shift. Present that day was Rajan Mishra, 46, one of the most experienced ladle operators in the plant. He had spent 11 years handling molten steel transfers inside the government-contracted foundry after starting there as a floor sweeper in his 20s. And with his experience, you can say he understood the ladle system better than many supervisors. According to the reports I gathered, the foundry was already behind schedule on a railway infrastructure contract that morning. Maintenance reports had flagged a leaking hydraulic seal on the ladle tilt arm almost 2 weeks earlier. Mechanics recommended replacing it during a shutdown period, but production managers delayed repairs to avoid missing shipment quotas tied to financial penalties. The casting floor was also understaffed that morning. 26-year-old Deepak Sharma, a newer worker with limited experience around active pours, had been assigned near the mold guides, while 41-year-old maintenance technician Suresh Patel checked equipment beneath the platform. Investigators later found neither had been warned that a full capacity transfer was about to begin above them. In a foundry this loud, workers often relied more on routine and timing than direct communication because it was difficult to hear instructions across the bay. The system used hydraulic cylinders to tilt a 40-ton vessel filled with molten steel heated to nearly 1,600 degrees Celsius. Operators controlled the pour from behind reinforced glass because even a small spill could ignite clothing or melt equipment within seconds. Workers nearby later said the heat around active pours felt strong enough to dry your throat almost immediately. The pour started normally at approximately 8:42 a.m. Molten steel flowed cleanly into the receiving mold, while Rajan monitored pressure gauges from the control station. Roughly halfway through the transfer, the hydraulic pressure suddenly dropped. Workers nearby heard a loud cracking sound, followed by a heavy metallic slam from the tilt assembly. Several men reportedly looked up at the same time because that sound did not belong in a normal pour. The hydraulic arm failed almost instantly. Instead of holding position, the 40-ton ladle lurched forward beyond the safe pouring angle. Rajan immediately hit the emergency stop. The vessel's momentum carried molten steel sideways over the mold wall. A wave of burning metal burst across the platform, scattering sparks and slag through the bay. Witnesses later compared it to a wall of bright liquid exploding outward faster than anyone could react. Deepak was standing closest to the mold guide when the spill reached him. Witnesses later said he barely had time to turn toward the noise before molten steel struck his legs and torso. His clothing ignited immediately. Workers later said he collapsed before reaching the nearest ladder. The temperature was intense enough to blister paint off nearby railings within seconds, so you can probably imagine what standing that close did to the human body. Below the platform, Suresh was caught beneath the spill through openings in the steel grating overhead. Molten metal and burning slag rained onto his shoulders, back, and neck while he tried crawling away beneath the machinery. Co-workers dragged him out using welding blankets as emergency alarms echoed across the bay. One worker called emergency services, and plant medics arrived roughly 6 minutes later, carrying oxygen tanks and burn kits. To give you a detail of how bad the accident was, several workers reportedly ran outside vomiting, while others had to cover their faces with their shirts just to get close enough to pull him out. Deepak died at the scene before paramedics arrived. Suresh was transported to a hospital with severe burns across most of his upper body. Doctors placed him on ventilation and treated him for shock, but the damage was too extensive. He died roughly 2 hours later after multiple organs failed from heat trauma and blood loss. The post-mortem examination found that Deepak suffered immediate fatal destruction to the lungs, airway, and internal organs caused by direct contact with molten steel. Suresh's report documented 3rd and 4th degree burns across nearly 70% of his body, along with severe inhalation injuries. The Labor Department temporarily suspended foundry operations and cited the company for delaying hydraulic repairs and failing to clear workers from the hazard zone. Rajan later told investigators the hydraulic issues had been reported multiple times before the accident, but repairs were repeatedly postponed to keep production running. Limited operations later resumed in unaffected sections of the facility after emergency repairs and initial inspections, while the damaged production area remained closed during the continuing investigation. It was November 2015 in Cleveland, Ohio, a Rust Belt city on the southern edge of Lake Erie, where water treatment plants, rail yards, and utility infrastructure stretched across the east side. Much of the work that kept the system running happened underground, out of sight, and often alone. Gus Tollefree had been a maintenance technician at a municipal water treatment facility on the city's east side for 6 years. He was 39, avoidant in the way that made him easy to overlook, the kind of person who agreed with whatever his supervisor said to sidestep friction and rarely asked questions even when he should have. He signed forms without reading them, skipped steps he found cumbersome, and had developed a habit of entering below-grade chambers alone, despite the facility's mandatory 2-person entry rule. Nobody had written him up for it. The facility had a below-grade maintenance chamber adjacent to a primary settling tank, 18 feet underground, accessible only through a single 24-inch entry hatch and a fixed vertical ladder. A slow seal failure on a settling tank valve had been allowing water to seep into the chamber wall cavity for 6 weeks. The seepage had gone unreported because the chamber floor drain had been partially blocked by debris since a pipe replacement job in August, preventing standing water from showing at the surface. The chamber had been sealed and unoccupied for 4 days before Gus's scheduled visit. During that time, organic decomposition of debris in the blocked drain consumed oxygen inside the enclosed space, bringing the atmosphere down to approximately 12%. Well below the threshold at which a person loses consciousness within seconds of exposure. The facility supervisor scheduled Gus for a routine pump housing inspection on November 10th. Gus signed the confined space entry permit at 7:12 a.m. without reading past page 1, missing the atmospheric testing requirement on page 2. His assigned entry attendant, Pete Harwick, 41, was supposed to remain at the hatch for the duration of the entry. Pete stepped away at 7:18 a.m. to take a phone call near the parking lot. The facility supervisor remained in the facility office and was not on the floor at the time. At 7:20 a.m., Gus descended the ladder alone. No atmospheric test, no radio check-in, no attendant at the hatch. He reached the chamber floor at 7:21 a.m. Standing water approximately 4 inches deep covered the entire floor, not visible from the hatch above. At 12% oxygen, loss of consciousness occurs within seconds of exposure. Gus stepped off the ladder and collapsed before he could take more than 1 or 2 steps, falling face forward into the standing water. At 7:23 a.m., the entry attendant returned to the hatch and called down twice. No response. Gus's work light was visible at the bottom, stationary. The attendant started down the ladder and descended 4 rungs before dizziness forced him back. He pushed himself down 2 more rungs, calling Gus's name, before the dizziness became incapacitation and he lost his grip. He fell back onto the surface and landed hard on the concrete beside the hatch opening, striking his head. A second facility worker crossing the floor saw the attendant on the ground beside the open hatch with the unmoving light below, and Gus, face down in the standing water, visible from the opening above. He moved toward the hatch to descend, and the facility supervisor, arriving 40 seconds after the attendant's radio call, pulled him back from the edge. Gus Tollefree and Pete Harwick did not survive. When the chamber was ventilated and entry was made, Gus was found face down in 4 inches of standing water at the base of the ladder. Pete Harwick was found on the surface beside the hatch, his injuries consistent with the fall and with brief exposure to the oxygen-deficient atmosphere during his descent. The work light was still on beside Gus. Atmospheric testing conducted after ventilation confirmed the chamber oxygen level had been at approximately 12% at floor level. The entry permit Gus had signed was recovered with page 2 unsigned and the atmospheric testing checkbox blank. The case was ruled an industrial accident resulting from confined space entry without atmospheric testing or attendant supervision. The facility was cited for procedural failures in its confined space entry program. No criminal charges were filed. It was August 12, 2015. In Phoenix, Arizona, where the late afternoon temperature had climbed to 109 degrees Fahrenheit after nearly a week of excessive heat warnings. At a mid-sized apartment complex on the city's west side, the multi-level parking garage sat mostly empty during peak afternoon hours. Its enclosed concrete design restricted airflow, allowing heat to build rapidly between thick structural walls. Zelda Finch, 27, lived at the complex and worked as a leasing support staff member for a different property across town. That afternoon, she remained at home longer than usual, organizing inspection documentation and reviewing maintenance photos. Shortly after 4 p.m., she gathered her belongings and headed to the garage to run errands before sunset. For months, Finch had been locked in a worsening personal dispute with another resident, Dana Lusk, 30, who lived in the same building. The conflict stemmed from repeated parking violations. Lusk frequently blocked Finch's assigned space, forcing her to wait or park on upper levels. After repeated confrontations failed, Finch began reporting the violations through the resident system. Citations followed, and Lusk's garage access privileges were eventually restricted. Other residents described the tension as obvious and ongoing. While management issued general parking reminders, the conflict remained a personal standoff rather than a workplace matter. Lusk, a long-term tenant, was familiar with the garage layout and gate systems after years of daily use, including the location of traffic sensors and access controls. Shortly after 4:15 p.m., Finch entered her vehicle and began driving toward the garage exit. As she approached the gate, Lusk interfered with the garage's vehicle detection system, wedging an object near the sensor that controlled the gate's movement. The obstruction caused the system to register a constant vehicle presence, keeping the barrier in a closed state. Surveillance footage later showed no other cars entering the garage during that window. An undetected wiring defect in the gate's control circuit prevented the system from clearing the fault once it was triggered, leaving the barrier unresponsive to normal reset commands. Finch stopped a few feet from the barrier and waited, assuming the delay was routine. After several moments, she pressed the gate call button and attempted to reverse, but the narrow lane and concrete barriers limited her maneuverability. Within minutes, the temperature inside her vehicle began rising sharply. The garage's concrete structure radiated stored heat, and the greenhouse effect caused the interior to warm faster than the surrounding air. Finch attempted to attract attention by honking and exiting her vehicle, but the garage remained empty. When the call system failed to respond, she returned to the car, conserving energy as the air grew heavy and stagnant. A resident returning from work nearly 20 minutes later noticed the stalled vehicle near the exit and forced the gate open manually after the sensor failed to respond. Finch was found unconscious behind the wheel after prolonged exposure to extreme heat. Emergency responders initiated resuscitation efforts, but she never regained consciousness. The medical examiner later determined that sustained hyperthermia following rapid incapacitation led to organ failure and death. An investigation into the gate malfunction revealed an underlying wiring defect and confirmed that the barrier had entered a faulted closed state after its vehicle detection sensor was deliberately obstructed. Surveillance footage and access timing placed Lusk in the garage shortly before the malfunction occurred. Confronted with the findings, Lusk admitted to interfering with the gate mechanism, stating he believed the disruption would be temporary and would resolve once another vehicle approached. Prosecutors argued that deliberately confining someone in a sealed structure during extreme heat demonstrated reckless disregard for human life, regardless of intent. Lusk was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. The case prompted changes to garage access controls across several residential complexes in the area, particularly during summer heat advisories. It's August 9, 2016, at an airport in Manila. Flights were running behind schedule, and Gate 12 was in the middle of a tight turnaround, leaving the staff distracted and rushing between tasks. Enter Crisanto Belen, who was 67, and to his family, he was just Chris. He wasn't a frequent flyer. In fact, he'd spent 30 years behind a desk in Tarlac handling paperwork. He was a meticulous, quiet guy who hated making mistakes. He was flying to Cebu for his brother's 70th birthday, only his second time ever on a plane. In his bag were a few gifts and his daily asthma inhaler. Boarding for his flight started around 7:15 p.m. Chris scanned his pass and walked down the jet bridge. But right at the plane door, he panicked. He thought he lost his inhaler. Now, if you don't have asthma, that might seem like a minor thing. But for someone who relies on it to breathe, realizing it's missing is an instant, terrifying emergency. Naturally, he turned around and walked back up the jet bridge to check his bag. The crew saw him leave, but they just assumed he'd be right back. Honestly, that's where the first domino fell. Nobody bothered to check why an elderly man was walking backwards against the flow of traffic. By the time Chris found his inhaler tucked safely inside his bag, the boarding was totally done. And this is where the system completely failed him. The investigation reports showed that the ground crew thought the flight attendants checked the bridge. The flight attendants thought the ground crew did it. It was a classic case of everyone assuming it was someone else's job, so nobody actually walked the bridge. At 7:27 p.m., the jet bridge pulled away from the plane. The terminal doors locked automatically. Chris was trapped in the middle. Through the glass, he watched his plane back away. And to make matters worse, his inhaler was almost empty. At 7:34 p.m., he hit the emergency intercom. Nothing. It turns out that the intercom had been broken for 11 days and nobody bothered to fix it. He started banging on the doors, but the gate area was already a ghost town. The staff had moved on to the next flight. Security footage from the bridge is actually heartbreaking to watch for me. He's pacing, looking out the windows, desperately trying to get the attention of anyone on the tarmac. The air in that enclosed bridge is thick and suffocating. As his anxiety spiked, his asthma kicked in. He kept hitting his inhaler until it completely ran out. By 8:40 p.m., he was visibly struggling to breathe. Around 9 p.m., Chris slid down the wall and sat on the floor. He tried to get back up, but he just didn't have the strength. By 9:40 p.m., he collapsed. It wasn't until 10:02 p.m., nearly 2.5 hours after he was locked in, that a gate agent preparing for a different flight happened to notice movement on the bridge camera. They opened the door and called for help, but it was too late. Chris died at the hospital later that night. The medical report said he died of severe respiratory failure from an asthma attack that just wouldn't stop. He suffocated because his airways closed up. Investigators blamed a mix of corporate laziness, a broken intercom, a hot room, panic, and a massive lack of communication. 2 supervisors got suspended, and airport management suddenly made it a rule to check jet bridges before planes leave. They even fixed the Gate 12 intercom within 2 days. Funny how fast things get fixed after someone dies. It was March 7, 2018. in a 12-story office tower in downtown St. Louis, where late-evening maintenance work was being conducted during a scheduled power system test. The building's emergency lighting cast dim shadows through the corridors, and most tenants had left hours earlier. Two emergency stairwells provided the primary evacuation routes, with Stairwell A typically remaining unlocked during maintenance operations, while Stairwell B was under a temporary security override. Selma Jory, a 51-year-old facilities supervisor, was conducting her final inspection of the day before the building's weekend closure. She was a veteran employee nearing retirement, known for her thorough approach to safety protocols and her dedication to maintaining building standards. Her colleagues described her as meticulous and professional. Mark Ellison, a 45-year-old maintenance contractor, had been working in the building for several years and was familiar with the emergency door systems. The magnetic door locks could be controlled remotely from the main security panel. 2 weeks earlier, Jory had hired Ellison for kitchen renovation work through his side handyman business. The results were substandard: crooked cabinets, faulty electrical work, and water damage. When Ellison refused refunds or repairs, Jory posted scathing reviews on Yelp, Google, and Facebook with photos of the shoddy work. Other customers came forward with similar complaints, and Ellison's side business collapsed overnight. Text messages from his phone showed growing anger, including threats to teach her a lesson. That evening, Jory was wearing a body-mounted safety camera, as required by building policy during solo inspections. An unrelated electrical fault within the building's ventilation control system had begun generating smoke that migrated upward through the stairwell shafts, though this was not immediately apparent. As Jory entered Stairwell B to inspect the emergency lighting, Ellison activated the magnetic door override from the security panel. Because the building was undergoing a scheduled power system test, standard fire release interlocks for Stairwell B were temporarily offline, leaving the magnetic lock engaged despite the smoke. He later admitted to investigators that he intended to trap her temporarily as payback for the online reviews, believing she would eventually be found when security made their rounds. The electrical fault suddenly worsened, filling Stairwell B with thick smoke. Jory attempted to force the sealed door, but could not overcome the magnetic locking mechanism. The body camera recorded her increasingly desperate attempts to escape as smoke continued to accumulate. The concrete stairwell acted as a chimney, concentrating the smoke and reducing visibility to near zero. Jory lost her footing on the steps and fell down multiple concrete risers, striking her head and back against the hard surfaces. The body camera continued recording until the battery failed. Building security discovered the electrical fault during a routine sweep and initiated emergency ventilation procedures. Jory was found unconscious in Stairwell B when responders forced the door open. She was pronounced dead at the scene from a combination of smoke inhalation and traumatic injuries sustained during the fall. Security system logs showed that the magnetic door lock had been activated from the main panel during the time frame when Jory was conducting her inspection. Ellison initially denied involvement, but later admitted to sealing the door, claiming he was unaware of the electrical fault and insisting he only meant to scare her. Investigators determined that while Ellison could not have anticipated the electrical malfunction, his deliberate action of confining Jory in the stairwell as retaliation for a personal grievance directly contributed to her death. Mark Ellison was charged with first-degree involuntary manslaughter. After a 3-week trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in state prison. During sentencing, the judge noted that Ellison's vindictiveness over negative online reviews had cost Selma Jory her life and devastated her family. Ellison showed minimal remorse during the proceedings, maintaining that he never intended for anyone to get hurt. The Jory family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both Ellison and the building management company that settled for an undisclosed sum before trial.